Hi, I'm Jeffrey Barber with the Integrated Strategies Forum, a nonprofit organization based in Silver Spring, Maryland, and this presentation is entitled Beyond Dystopia, Apocalypse, and Techno-fantasy, Imagining Sustainability Transitions in Science Fiction Futures. In this presentation, we consider two basic questions. How does science fiction literature and cinema portray and explore transitions to sustainability? And how can sustainable future fiction help lessen and possibly reverse the destructive impacts of today's unsustainable practices and policies? As Kim Stanley Robinson put it, we are now living in a science fiction novel that we're all writing together. As this quote implies, we are each engaged in a collective process of shaping the future, a global and personal narrative encompassing a wide-ranging and diverse cast of characters. In this collective writing process, we each need to reflect on the consequences of our choices and actions within this larger global story. Although we act and experience the world as individuals, we are social creatures. Our behavior, values, views, and identities are linked and interdependent with those other individuals and communities, which give our actions, views, and lives meaning. As character and author in this global narrative, we need to reflect not only on our personal desires and commitments, but also the ultimate consequences of those choices we make and actions we take. Because, for future generations, those actions can be a regrettable curse or a gift of love. Whether you mark the beginning of science fiction with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, H.G. Wells' Time Machine, or Jules Verne's Fantastic Voyages, these stories all share far-sighted reflections on the possibilities and consequences of humanity's choices and actions in the quest for scientific knowledge, manifested and amplified through technology and industry. Science fiction is itself a product of the modern era's scientific and industrial revolutions. It is also a fitting lens to assess and critique these developments of the modern era, its meaning within the wider Anthropocene, and their social and environmental impacts. The world of the new millennium faces an alarming number of those impacts: global warming, desertification and freshwater scarcity, rising sea levels and flooding, economic inequality, biodiversity loss and ecological decline, the propagation and trade of increasingly sophisticated weapons of destruction, as well as propaganda justifying and thus deepening those destructive impacts. Science fiction has in turn responded to many of these threats and challenges, providing not only public attention and social critique, but also the personal experience of what it might be like to face these threats up close. The question, however, is, to what degree does science fiction explore not just the threats, but possible solutions and alternatives to today's crises? That is, how far has science fiction embraced the challenge of imagining transitions to sustainable futures? What is sustainability? There are a lot of different definitions of sustainability. This is a concept about how we shape our future, about how our choices and actions in meeting our particular needs affect the lives of others, including future generations. Sustainability is not simply about protecting the environment, but also ensuring social equity, specifically the goal to achieve a higher quality of life for all people. Although it is a complex and contested concept, sustainability nevertheless provides a constructive framework in the search for solutions to the planet's increasingly wicked problems. It also offers a frame for thought experiments for imagining alternative futures. In the second decade of the new millennium, there has been a notable surge of discussions, complaints, and theories about the appeal of dystopian films and novels. A number of dystopian novels are well-known literary classics, such as 1984, Brave New World, and Fahrenheit 451, cautionary tales that have become major reference points on how things could be, reflecting our concerns about authoritarianism, as well as nuclear devastation and random violence. Certain stories, such as Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep and John Brunner's Shockwave Rider, have influenced the development of a whole new subgenre of dystopian stories, known as cyberpunk. William Gibson's Neuromancer is frequently cited as one of the early proponents of this subgenre. These were in turn followed by a proliferation of variations and series, including what's been called post-cyberpunk. These stories often feature hard-boiled, somewhat cynical urban characters making their way through dark alleys and cyberspatial landscapes, dividing the powerful rich and desperate poor through an ambience of high-tech, plugged-in future noir. We saw the 1956 British production of the iconic 1984, later remade in the year 1984, with a new remake due in 2019. Early on, we see films like On the Beach, and many others reflecting fear of nuclear war as well as of authoritarianism in Fahrenheit 451 and Jean-Luc Godard's Alphaville. The latter a mix of the hard-boiled Raymond Chandler-esque detective within a 1984 setting, a familiar combination in cyberpunk. Also, in 1968, we are introduced to a new psychedelic style of the schizophrenic computer rebellion plot in Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. As with dystopian novels, dystopian films began appearing with a vengeance, with Soylent Green and Logan's Run reflecting fears of overpopulation, and Mad Max: The Road Warrior providing the standard reference to post-apocalyptic war over oil. And on the cusp of the millennium appeared The Matrix, questioning the reality of our daily experience. In 2004, we saw the fast-forward, epic-action, cli-fi companion to Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, The Day After Tomorrow. Also that year, Robot Rebellion, followed by depressing glimpses into the end of the world. Then we saw the rapid rise of an extremely popular and profitable youth dystopia industry, and more recently, remakes of classic dystopian movies, of classic dystopian novels. Which brings to mind Time magazine's timely question, where are our bright science fiction futures? Where are the stories that go beyond dystopia? Stories about transitions towards a sustainable world. Is sustainability utopian, unrealistic, or just naive? Ending poverty and hunger, ensuring clean water, healthcare and education for everyone, protecting our ecosystems and living in sustainable communities, achieving gender and racial equality, moving away from fossil fuels and unsustainable production and consumption. And do all those sustainable development goals that so many governments and organizations around the world are now talking about really just wishful thinking? Or perhaps the kinds of stressful things we don't want to think about? The kinds of things we go to the movies or read a good book to escape? Is all this talk utopian? We have a long tradition of utopian thinking and literature from Plato, Thomas More, William Morris, Edward Bellamy, H.G. Wells, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and many others. However, utopia has received a bad rap. For many of us, utopia means either nowhere or worse, a deception, a sinister temptation leading us into a dangerous trap. Of course, in this modern age, we are constantly getting sales pitches, advertising, promises that often lead to disappointment. On the other hand, if we do not take responsibility for where we want to go, we will end up where someone else takes us. A different definition of utopia is offered by Ruth Levitas, who views utopia as about how we would live and what kind of world we would live in if we could do just that. If we want to live in a sustainable future, we need to imagine what that might be and what it should look like. One of the functions of sustainable future fiction is to do just that. Tom Moylan identified a new generation of utopian writings in the 1970s as critical utopias, focusing more specifically on the struggles involved in transitions to more sustainable futures, identifying and challenging the dystopian forces and constraints to be overcome. Ernst Kallenbach's Ecotopia involved the secession of the Pacific Coast from the rest of the United States in order to develop an automobileless, environmentally benign region. Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed imagined an anarchistic, utopian world struggling with resource scarcity as well as the difficulties of establishing a truly equalitarian culture. And in writing Woman at the Edge of Time, Marge Piercy explained that she wanted, quote, to show an ecologically sound society. The lives and institutions and rituals of Mattapoisett all stress being part of nature and responsible for the natural world. In imagining the good society, I borrowed from all the progressive movements of that time. Like most women's utopias, the novel is profoundly anarchist and aimed at integrating people back into the natural world and eliminating power relationships. Moylan identifies Kim Stanley Robinson's Pacific Edge in 1990 as one of the few utopian novels standing out against the dystopian cyberpunk wave that rose up during the 1980s period of conservative anti-environmental backlash. This is a story of life in 2065 of the utopian community of El Modena, told through the character of Kevin Claiborne. Kevin's grandfather, Tom Bernard, in turn, tells the earlier transition story of the painful but ultimately successful political struggle with multinationals and conservative governments which gradually achieved the kind of global cooperation enabling the spread of more sustainable and egalitarian communities. Robinson brought this green participatory governance theme to his Mars trilogy on establishment of equalitarian human settlements while terraforming a harsh, inhospitable planet. In Green Earth is the edited combination of his Science in the Capital trilogy about how the U.S. responds to the various impacts of climate and the struggle to establish a climate-friendly national government and policies. And New York 2140 portrays human adaptation and climate politics in a flooded New York City. What would Jane Jacobs say about that? Leaving the world of books for the electronic beyond of TV and cinema, we come to the most famous utopian space opera narrative, Star Trek. Introduced in 1966, this story universe and industry spawned 6 different television series, the most recent being Star Trek Discovery, along with multiple movies and novelizations. Star Trek was one of the few science fiction universes that grapple with the idea that money may someday become obsolete. And in the words of Jean-Luc Picard, We've overcome hunger and greed, and we're no longer interested in the accumulation of things. However, Star Trek is a techno-fantasy. Its solutions to the problems of hunger and greed is the wonderful nanotechno-magical Aladdin's lamp, the replicator. Unfortunately, despite the emergence of 3D printers, we still have no actual replicators in our near-future pipeline. Another utopian space opera of note, up to this point a series of novels, but soon to come to the digital screen, is The Culture. In contrast to the more pessimistic future noir vision of Blade Runner and cyberpunk, The Culture is a far future, post-scarcity, highly equalitarian civilization of humans, panhumans, and hyper-intelligent AI minds whose aim is to help to reduce or eliminate suffering, to devote its functionally infinite resources and near godlike technological and productive capabilities to assisting less fortunate civilizations. The Culture appears through various characters, impressions, and influences across a range of stories published between 1987 and 2012. This is the work of Scottish author Iain M. Banks, who unfortunately passed away before seeing his vision become a television series. Announced by Amazon this past February, beginning with the first book, Consider Phlebas. Far from being the dystopian nightmares that we're used to, screenwriter Dennis Kelly explains, Banks creates a kind of flawed paradise, a society truly worth fighting for, rather than a warning from the future. His books are a beckoning. Another important visionary is the late Octavia Butler, who, in 1979, gave us the powerful time travel novel Kindred, and later Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, the latter books about the painful struggle of transition against dystopian violence and desperation, as well as a presidential candidate running on a dismantle government platform to, yes, make America great again. Butler's response is with hope and a spiritual vision of change and interdependence which guides her Earthseed community. Butler also wrote the Xenogenesis series of novels, Dawn, Adulthood Rights, and Imago, about an African-American woman who, surviving a suicidal war which wipes out almost the entire human race, works with aliens to resurrect humanity 250 years later, with some significant alterations. Once more, leaving the world of books, the magazine Variety recently confirmed that Ava DuVernay will be adapting Butler's Dawn into a new television series. Finally, in his review of the new Star Trek Discovery series, Joseph Orozco of the Anaris Project for Alternative Futures cites Octavia Butler's Earthseed series, describing it as a story of how to cope and overcome dystopia, with a rich sense of humanity and how to take the steps toward utopia. Noting that we are in a dystopian and skeptical era, he explains, "We want a more Butlerian Star Trek now. What we crave now is more guidance through adversity. We want to know how to get to the post-scarcity utopia represented by the Federation and Starfleet." We conclude with a few basic questions. What is needed to see more films, novels, and popular culture in general imagine and explore more hopeful and sustainable futures? What combination of factors will inspire more realistic portrayals of transitions to that future? And what will it take for the large film and publishing companies as well as independent producers to support near-future stories reflecting the hopes, visions, strategies, and struggles of activists, social movements, changing institutions, and concerned citizens today? And will it make a difference? Will enough writers, filmmakers, and other cultural producers believe enough in a sustainable future to create and share more stories about how we get there? Thank you.